For coming. I'm Dick Samuels, and I'm the director of the Center for International Studies at MIT. And we're all here this evening because John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt have written a very important book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. And it's the sort of book that stirs passions and generates vigorous debate, which is a very rare accomplishment for academics. And the fact is, these are rare and very accomplished academics. John Mearsheimer is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago, where he's also the co-director of the program on international security policy. And his most recent previous book, was The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. Stephen Walt holds the Robert and Renee Belfer Professorship in International Affairs at the John F. Kennedy School of Government here in Cambridge. And his most recent previous book was Taming American Power: The Global Response to U.S. Primacy. Now, neither John nor Steve is anything close to being a stranger to MIT forums, and we're delighted they've agreed to return yet again this evening. Now, if this was a normal book talk, put that in air quotes, we wouldn't have an additional speaker this evening. But as the size of this filled room attests, the passions and the stakes run high enough, I think, to warrant departing from the norm. So I've asked Bruce Riedel to serve as a discussant this evening. Bruce also, fortunately, is no stranger to MIT forums, so we're delighted that he's back as well. He's currently the senior fellow at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. But he spent most of his career inside the U.S. government, specializing on the Middle East, particularly on Middle East policy, including stints as a special assistant to the President of the United States and Senior Director for Near East and North African Affairs at the National Security Council. He also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs. Last year, Bruce was awarded the Department of State's Meritorious Service Award. He brings a well-informed and thoughtful practitioner's perspective to our conversation this evening. Now, in order to allow for maximum time and maximum interaction with the audience, what I've done is ask John and Steve to split the first 30 minutes between themselves, present their views in half an hour, and then ask Bruce to respond in 15 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to the floor, and I'll have additional instructions for the audience at that point. Thank you very much. Excuse me. Then we'll have 45 minutes and an additional 45 minutes. Steve?
I want to thank Dick and the Center for International Studies for inviting us here, and I want to thank Bruce for coming up and offering his comments later. And most importantly, I want to thank all of you for coming. We are looking forward to having a lively discussion. We want to talk about two main questions today. First, is there a powerful pro-Israel lobby in the United States? And if so, how does it work? Second, on balance, is its impact positive or negative for the United States and also for Israel? I will tackle the first question, which is the easy one, and John will address the second. But before I get started, I want to acknowledge how difficult it is to raise this subject and why it needs to get handled with some sensitivity. If we were here today to talk about energy policy in the United States, it would be natural for us to talk about the political activities of oil companies. If we were talking about gun control, you wouldn't be that surprised if I mentioned the National Rifle Association. But when the subject is U.S. Middle East policy and you bring up the Israel lobby, you are reaching out and grabbing the third rail with both hands. Now, that's partly because some groups in the lobby are quick to attack anyone who identifies their influence or questions the policies that they're advocating. But it's also because that discussion takes place in the shadow of centuries of anti-Semitism, which includes bizarre conspiracy theories like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and, of course, tragic events like the Holocaust. And that history shapes how we all think about this issue. So if you talk about a powerful interest group that is mostly, though not exclusively, comprised of Jewish Americans, some will think you're saying that there's a secret cabal to control American foreign policy. If you say that media coverage in the United States tends to be pro-Israel, it sounds to some like you're making the old charge that Jews control the media. If you talk about campaign contributions by pro-Israel political action committees, doing what all political action committees do, some people think you're saying that Jewish money is doing something illicit or improper. So I want to make it clear at the outset that John and I reject every one of those anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. For us, the Israel lobby is just an interest group, like lots of other interest groups in the United States. Most of its activities are entirely appropriate and legitimate forms of political engagement. We don't question Israel's right to exist or its legitimacy, and we believe the United States should come to Israel's aid if its survival is ever in jeopardy. But we also think that the activities of the lobby and its impact on U.S. foreign policy are subjects that reasonable people ought to be able to discuss openly, the same way we would discuss any other groups that try and shape American policy on any issue, foreign or domestic. All right, with that as background, the late Yitzhak Rabin once said that U.S. support for Israel was, quote, beyond compare in modern history, and he was right. It's the largest recipient of U.S. economic and military aid, currently getting about $500 per year for each Israeli citizen. Even though Israel's per capita income is now 29th in the world, it is not a poor country like Bangladesh, and it gets this aid even when it does things that the United States formally opposes, like building settlements in the occupied territories. Israel gets consistent diplomatic backing. We almost always take its side in regional disputes, and it's rarely, if ever, criticized by U.S. officials, and certainly not by anybody who aspires to high office. And all you have to do is look at the current presidential campaign, where every major candidate seems to be competing to see who can demonstrate the greatest personal devotion to Israel. The question is why? Now, the usual answer is that Israel is a vital strategic asset and a country that shares our values. But if you step back and view those two rationales objectively, they can't explain why we give so much aid and why we give it so unconditionally. Israel may well have been a strategic asset during the Cold War, but the Cold War is now over. Today, giving Israel nearly unconditional support is one of the reasons we have a terrorism problem, and it makes it harder to address a variety of problems in the Middle East. Again, our problems in the Middle East would not disappear if the United States had a different relationship with Israel, and the United States does benefit from various forms of strategic cooperation. But it's hard to argue that unconditional support is making the United States more popular around the world or making American citizens more secure here at home. On balance, that can't explain why we give it so much help. Second, as for the claim that Israel's a democracy that shares our values, yes, Israel is a vibrant democracy, but so are lots of other states, and none of them gets the same level of aid or so unconditionally. Plus, Israel's treatment of its Arab citizens, and especially its Palestinian subject, is sharply at odds with American values, not consistent with them at all. Nor is Israel's behavior significantly better than that of the Palestinians. Now, I don't have time to go into lots of detail here, but I think any reasonably fair-minded look at the history of this region, including the more recent histories written by Israeli historians, show that both sides of this conflict have done many cruel things to each other, and neither side owns the moral high ground. Now, please note, I am not saying that Israel behaves worse than other countries do, only that it hasn't acted any better. And so you cannot justify unconditional American aid by saying that its conduct is somehow exemplary. Now, again, I want to emphasize that we think there's a strong moral case for Israel's existence based on the long history of anti-Semitism, and we believe the United States should come to its aid if its survival is at risk. The good news is its existence is not at risk today, and past crimes against the Jewish people do not justify a blank check now. So what explains this unusual special relationship? Well, in our view, it's the political influence of the lobby. The lobby is a loose coalition of individuals and groups that works openly to influence U.S. foreign policy in a pro-Israel direction. I'm thinking of organizations like AIPAC, the Conference of Presidents, the Zionist Organization of America, Christians United for Israel, think tanks like the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, the American Enterprise Institute, publications like the Weekly Standard, the New Republic. Now, that's a broad definition, but if you think about it, most interest groups have several different components to them. The environmental movement isn't just Greenpeace and the Sierra Club. It also includes research organizations, sympathetic local chapters, academics who work on issues like global warming, journalists who write about it, etc., the same way the pro-Israel movement does. It's not a centralized organization. The groups that make it up do not agree on every single issue. And it's certainly not a cabal or conspiracy to control American foreign policy. It's just an interest group, a particularly influential one, that operates the same way other interest groups operate. Its actions, as we like to say, are as American as apple pie. Now, the key point to emphasize here is the lobby is also not synonymous with Jewish Americans. Surveys repeatedly show that about a quarter to a third of Jewish Americans don't care that much about Israel one way or the other. Others do not support the lobby's positions, and some of the groups that work on Israel's behalf, such as the so-called Christian Zionists, aren't Jewish. The lobby is defined by the positions it favors, not by ethnicity or religion. And finally, it doesn't include anybody who happens to have a favorable attitude towards Israel. One has to actively work to try and influence American policy in a pro-Israel direction to be part of the Israel lobby. So how does it work? Well, in American politics, small groups with a focused agenda often wield disproportionate influence because they care a lot about the issue, and politicians can win their support without losing anybody else's. And like other interest groups, the Israel lobby works in two main ways. First, it exerts influence inside the Beltway by getting sympathetic people elected to office or appointed to key positions, and by giving politicians clear incentives to embrace the positions they favor. Organizations like AIPAC work 24/7 to convince politicians to support their views. This is an organization, by the way, with a budget of about $50 million a year, very active on Capitol Hill, drafting legislation, providing talking points, highly professional, energetic grassroots base behind it. Very effective organization. But it's not a political action committee itself, despite its name, and it doesn't contribute money to campaigns. However, AIPAC does help vet candidates for office and helps steer campaign contributions from individuals and pro-Israel political action committees that do exist. And to give you a sense of what the balance of power is like in Washington, since 1992, pro-Israel political action committees have contributed about $55 million in American elections. By contrast, Arab American political action committees have given about $800,000 in that same period, which gives you some sense of what the balance of power is like. Moreover, AIPAC and other groups over the last 30 years have helped drive a number of prominent politicians from office whom they deemed insufficiently supportive, including Paul Finley, Pete McCloskey, Charles Percy, Cynthia McKinney, Roger Jepson, and Lincoln Chafee. Again, I want to make it clear the lobby doesn't win every election that it weighs in on, but every congressman and every presidential candidate knows you are playing with fire if you question American support for Israel. That's why Steve Rosen, who's the AIPAC official now under indictment for passing classified information, once put a napkin in front of a journalist from the New Yorker and said, in 24 hours we could have the signatures of 70 senators on this napkin. Or as Senator Daniel Inouye explained when he was asked why he had signed an AIPAC-sponsored letter to President Ford, it's easier to sign one letter than to answer 5,000. Things are no different today. AIPAC was ranked the second most powerful lobby in Washington in the 2003 survey of congressional staffers and congressmen conducted by the National Journal, which, by the way, replicated an earlier survey done by Forbes magazine where AIPAC also came in second. Bill Clinton said AIPAC was better than anyone else lobbying in this town, and Newt Gingrich, who didn't agree with Clinton on much, said it was the most effective interest group across the entire planet. Former Congressman Lee Hamilton, who served in Congress for 34 years, said there's no group that matches it. They're in a class by themselves. Or as former Senator Fritz Hollings said as he was leaving office, you can't have an Israel policy other than what AIPAC gives you around here. So it's not surprising that Prime Minister Ehud Olmert said a year ago, thank God we have AIPAC, the greatest supporter and friend we have in the whole world. And again, I want to emphasize, it's not just AIPAC. AIPAC's one organization among several, including a subset of the Christian evangelicals. All right, so that's one strategy, operating within the Beltway the way other interest groups do. The second strategy is to try and shape public discourse so that Israel is viewed favorably by most Americans. Mainstream media in the United States tend to be pretty pro-Israel, especially in terms of editorials and commentary. If you look at pundits in the United States, there's simply no equivalent of a Robert Fisk or a Patrick Seal, who write in the United Kingdom, and certainly no equivalent of a Kiva Elder, Bradley Burston, Gideon Levy, or a Myra Haas, who write for Haaretz in Israel. My point, again, is not that those critics of Israeli policy are always right and pro-Israel pundits are always wrong. My point is you don't find voices like theirs in any of the mainstream media outlets in the United States. But even so, watchdog groups like the ADL or CAMERA monitor media coverage, organize boycotts and demonstrations against news agencies that publish anything critical, and groups like Campus Watch monitor activities on campus and put pressure on universities and scholars. So when Jimmy Carter published his book, Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid, the ADL and CAMERA took out ads in major newspapers which included the publisher's phone number and invited readers to call the publisher and complain about the publication of the book. And a few weeks ago, the Jewish newspaper Forward reported that CNN was coming under what it called unprecedented attack for its three-part series covering Jewish, Muslim, and Christian fundamentalism, and that the Conference of Presidents was urging member organizations to take up the issue with companies that had bought advertising slots for the program. Finally, efforts to stifle criticism often include smearing critics by accusing them of being anti-Semitic. So when Carter published his book, Martin Peretz of the New Republic said Carter will go down in history as a Jew hater. And a critic in the Washington Post compared Carter's views to those of David Duke. Needless to say, this was a common charge leveled at us when our original article was published, even though there is not the slightest shred of evidence behind the charge. And for instance, yesterday at MIT, a group called MIT Students for Israel sent an email around calling upon people to attend our talk and ask critical questions. That's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But the email also said that our book was, quote, disturbing for its similarity to the infamous fraud, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This is not rational discourse. This is smearing us by suggesting that we are anti-Semites like the people who wrote that bizarre conspiracy theory. If you read our book, you will find there is nothing anti-Semitic about it or anything remotely like the Protocols. So why does smearing go on? For three reasons. It distracts people from the real issue, which is U.S. policy. It deters people from criticizing Israeli policy, because who wants to be labeled an anti-Semite? And finally, it marginalizes people in the public arena. What politician would want to associate with someone who had been accused of being an anti-Semite, even if the accusation was false? So it helps marginalize people. And the bottom line here is, of course, there's very little serious debate on this subject in the United States, and especially not in Congress, even when it's obvious to virtually everybody that American Middle East policy has gone badly off the rails, and we ought to be having a very open discussion about how we could get it back on the rails. All right, I want to make one last point, and then I will turn it over to John. It is often said that the United States backs Israel because there is broad public support. Politicians are really just doing what the people want. And this argument isn't convincing for several reasons. It is true that the American people in survey after survey have a generally favorable attitude towards Israel. But they don't think, and this is also reflected in survey after survey, that the United States should be providing unconditional or one-sided support. In 2005, a survey conducted for the Anti-Defamation League found that 78% of Americans think the United States should favor neither side in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Another survey reported by Americans for Peace Now found that 87% of Jewish Americans favor a two-state solution. And finally, a poll by the University of Maryland in 2003 found that over 70% of politically active Americans favored cutting aid to Israel if it refused to settle the conflict. So Americans do have a generally favorable impression of Israel. They want it to exist. They want it to be secure and prosperous, as do John and I. But they are not insisting that we back it to the hilt and back it no matter what. But that's pretty much what our policy has been, and that gap is due mostly to the political influence of the various groups that make up the lobby. So now the question is overall the effect of the lobby's influence good or bad for the United States, good or bad for Israel? That is, in fact, a really easy question, and so I'll leave it for John. Thank you.
I, too, would like to thank Dick for his kind comments and for inviting Steve and me here tonight, and also thank all of you for turning out tonight to listen to us talk. Steve has defined the lobby, and he's made the case that it has a powerful influence on U.S. Middle East policy. I'll take the analysis a step further and argue that its influence has been largely negative. In a nutshell, our argument is that the lobby, working with Israel itself, has pushed U.S. Middle East policy in ways that are not in the American national interest, and I might add, not in Israel's interest either. I'm going to focus on two cases. First, how U.S. support for Israel's policies towards the Palestinians in the occupied territories has helped fuel terrorism against the United States. And second, the lobby's influence in the run-up to the Iraq War. There are three cases that we discuss in the book, which I won't talk about tonight because of time constraints, and that is U.S. policy towards Iran, U.S. policy towards Syria, and U.S. policy during the Lebanon War in the summer of 2006. Let me start with America's terrorism problem. The conventional wisdom among Israel's supporters is that Israel's treatment of the Palestinians has little to do with why the United States is so hated in the Arab and Islamic world, and more importantly, little to do with our terrorism problem. In fact, Israel is said to be a valuable ally in the fight against terror, and surely it's our most valuable ally in the Middle East. This received wisdom, however, is wrong. There's an abundance of survey data and anecdotal evidence which shows that U.S. support for Israel and its brutal treatment of the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank angers, if not enrages, huge numbers of people in the Arab and Islamic world. The State Department, for example, set up an advisory group on public diplomacy in Arab and Islamic countries, which reported in June 2003 that, quote, citizens in these countries are genuinely distressed at the plight of the Palestinians and at the role they perceive the United States to be playing. Not surprisingly, that anger helps fuel terrorism against the United States. Let me emphasize that I'm not saying that our support for Israel's policy towards the Palestinians is the only cause of our terrorism problem. I'm simply saying that it is a major cause. Specifically, it motivates some individuals to attack the United States. It serves as a powerful recruitment tool for terrorist organizations, and it generates sympathy and support for terrorists among huge numbers of people in the Arab and Islamic world. The hostility toward the United States generated by its support for Israel's policies in the occupied territories has been recognized by American presidents since 1967, when Israel first conquered Gaza and the West Bank. This is why the official policy of every president since Lyndon Johnson has been to oppose the building of settlements. But no president has been able to put meaningful pressure on Israel to stop building settlements. Indeed, as Steve pointed out, the U.S. has protected Israel from criticism at the United Nations and given Israel more foreign aid than any other country and given it unconditionally, despite the fact its behavior is contrary to official American policy. Of course, the reason that no president can put meaningful pressure on Israel to stop building settlements is the lobby. A critically important issue when talking about America's terrorism problem is the matter of how U.S. support for Israel's brutal treatment of the Palestinians relates to what happened on September 11th. It's commonplace to hear Israel's supporters say that, one, Osama bin Laden did not care much about the Palestinians until recently, and he only cares because it is an effective recruiting device. Two, the events of 9/11 had nothing to do with Israel. And three, those involved in the attack hated us because of who we are, not because of our policies. This line of argument is frequently purveyed by key figures in the lobby. For example, Robert Satloff from the Washington Institute claims that bin Laden's identification with the Palestinians is, quote, a recent and almost surely opportunistic phenomenon. Alan Dershowitz maintains that, quote, prior to September 11th, Israel was barely on bin Laden's radar screen. And Dennis Ross, who also works at the Washington Institute, says that bin Laden was merely, quote, trying to gain legitimacy by implying that this attack on America was about the plight of the Palestinians. These claims, however, are simply not true. It's clear from the historical record that bin Laden has been deeply concerned about the plight of the Palestinians since he was a young man. That concern was reflected in his public statements throughout the 1990s, well before 9/11. Consider what Max Rodenbeck, the Middle East correspondent for The Economist, wrote in a major review of 2 books on bin Laden, one of which was a compilation of his speeches. Quoting Rodenbeck, of all the themes, the notion of payback for injustices suffered by the Palestinians is perhaps the most powerfully recurrent in bin Laden's speeches. Regarding the actual attack on 9/11, we now know from the work of the 9/11 Commission that U.S. support for Israel was a major cause of the 9/11 attacks. It was not, and I want to emphasize, it was not the only cause for sure, but it was a key cause. For example, the 9/11 Commission reports that bin Laden wanted to make sure that the attackers struck Congress because it is the most important source of support for Israel in the United States. The Commission also reports that bin Laden twice wanted to move up the date of the attacks because of events involving Israel, even though doing so would have increased the risk of failure. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, consider what the 9/11 Commission says about the motives of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who it describes as, quote unquote, the principal architect of the attacks. Quoting from the Commission report, by his own account, KSM's animus towards the United States stemmed not from his experiences there as a student, but rather from his violent disagreement with U.S. foreign policy favoring Israel. It's hard to imagine more compelling evidence of the role that U.S. support for Israel played in the 9/11 attacks. In short, the present relationship between Washington and Jerusalem is helping to fuel America's terrorism problem. Let me now turn to Iraq. It's manifestly clear to most Americans that the Iraq War is one of the greatest strategic blunders in American history. Our argument is that Israel, and especially the lobby, were 2 of the main driving forces behind the decision to invade Iraq. It is hard to imagine that war happening in their absence. To start with Israel itself, it was the only country besides Kuwait where both the government and a majority of the population favored the war. The Israeli government, to include Prime Minister Sharon, pushed the Bush administration hard to make sure that it did not lose its nerve in the months before the invasion. Other influential Israelis, like former Prime Ministers Benjamin Netanyahu and Ehud Barak, also implored the United States to take down Saddam. In fact, Israel was pushing so hard for the United States to go to war that its allies in this country warned Israeli officials to damp down their rhetoric, lest it be seen as a war for Israel. I might add that President Clinton said that, this is in 2006, that, quote, every Israeli politician I knew believed that Iraq was such a great threat to the United States that we should attack it even if Iraq had no WMD. The Israeli public was also solidly behind the war. According to a February 2003 poll, that's a month before the war, 77.5% of Israelis said that they wanted the United States to attack Iraq. One sometimes hears the argument these days that Israel opposed the Iraq war and actually favored attacking Iran instead. There's no question that in early 2002, when the Israelis first got wind that the Bush administration was thinking about attacking Iraq, key Israeli officials went to Washington and made it clear that they thought that Iran was the greater enemy and that the Bush administration should focus on Tehran, not on Baghdad. It is important to emphasize, however, that Israel was not opposed to the United States toppling the regimes in Iraq or Syria, two countries that Jerusalem considers mortal enemies. Israel simply wanted the United States to deal with Iran first. But once the Israelis realized that the war party intended to deal with Iran after it finished the job in Iraq, and you want to remember that the war party and the Israelis both believed that we would win a quick and decisive victory in Iraq and then be free to move against Iran and Syria. But once the Israelis understood that the war party intended to deal with Iran after Iraq, it enthusiastically embraced the idea of invading Iraq. Thus, between early 2002 and March 2003, the Israelis put significant pressure on the Bush administration to make sure that it chose war over diplomacy with Iraq, while constantly reminding Washington not to forget that Iran must come after Iraq. I might add that there is no evidence that Israel warned the United States that Iraq would turn into a quagmire. Turning now to the lobby, there's no question that the neoconservatives, one of the core constituencies in the lobby, were the main driving force behind the war. But they were supported by the key organizations in the lobby, such as AIPAC. Now that the war has gone south, it is common to hear Israel's supporters say that the main organizations in the lobby did not push for war. But that's not true. This point is made clear in a May 2004 editorial that appeared in The Forward, a weekly Jewish newspaper based in New York. I'm going to read from the editorial now. This is a May 2004 editorial. As President Bush attempted to sell the war in Iraq, America's most important Jewish organizations rallied as one to his defense. In statement after statement, community leaders stressed the need to rid the world of Saddam Hussein and his weapons of mass destruction. Concern for Israel's safety rightfully factored into the deliberations of the main Jewish groups. One sometimes also hears the claim these days that AIPAC took no position on the Iraq war and certainly did not advocate it. This is not true either. First of all, this claim fails the common sense test, as AIPAC usually supports what Israel wants, and Israel certainly wanted the United States to invade Iraq. Second, there is hard evidence that AIPAC lobbied for the war. For example, AIPAC's executive director, Howard Kaur, told the New York Sun in January 2003 that one of AIPAC's successes over the past year was, quote, quietly lobbying Congress to approve the use of force in Iraq, end of quote. The neoconservatives, of course, were the main driving force behind the war. They initiated the idea of using force to topple Saddam in two letters written in early 1998 to President Clinton. Over the next 5 years, and especially after 9/11, they pushed relentlessly for a war against Iraq. No other group or institution in the United States was seriously committed to invading Iraq over that 5-year period. Indeed, there was significant opposition to invading Iraq even after 9/11 within the State Department, the intelligence community, and the uniformed military. The neoconservatives are, by their own admission, deeply committed to Israel. In fact, many of them are connected with key organizations in the lobby, like the American Enterprise Institute and the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Our argument here, it should be emphasized, is not that the neoconservatives or the leaders of the principal organizations in the lobby were pushing a war that was in Israel's interest, but not in the American national interest. On the contrary, we argue that they believed that invading Iraq was in both the American and Israeli national interests. For the neoconservatives, what is good for the United States is good for Israel, and vice versa. Although the neoconservatives were deeply committed to a war with Iraq, they could not make it happen by themselves. They failed to convince Clinton to go to Baghdad, and they had little luck selling the war in the first months of the Bush administration. I might also add that Steve and I have both said publicly that we believe that if Al Gore had been elected president, we would not have invaded Iraq either. It was the events of 9/11, however, that created the circumstances where the neoconservatives could help convince both President Bush and Vice President Cheney that invading Iraq was a smart idea. But without Bush and Cheney on board, there would not have been a war. All of this is to say that the neoconservatives were necessary to have the war, but by themselves, they could not make the war happen. One final point about Iraq before I go to the conclusion. We are sometimes accused of saying that the Iraq war was a Jewish war. Nothing could be further from the truth. We pointed out in the article that was written last March, actually March 2006, and we point out in the book that polls taken before the war show that American Jews were 10% less supportive of the war than the general American public. Our argument is that the war was due in large part to the influence of the Israel lobby, especially the neoconservatives within it, not the American Jewish community. And as Steve emphasized, the lobby, for us, is defined by its political agenda, not religion or ethnicity. Let me conclude with a brief word about what we think the U.S.-Israeli relationship should look like. To start, the United States should end its special relationship with Israel and should treat it like a normal country. It should treat it like other democracies, such as Britain, France, Germany, and India. In practice, this means that when Israel is acting in ways that are consistent with the American national interest, Washington should back the Jewish state. But when Israel is acting in ways that harm U.S. interests, Washington should distance itself from Israel and use its considerable leverage to get Israel to change its behavior, just as the United States would do with any other country that was acting in ways that might harm it. Regarding Israel's conflict with the Palestinians, the United States should act as an honest broker. In other words, Washington should pursue an even-handed policy towards the two sides. In particular, the United States should make it clear to Israel that it must abandon the occupied territories and allow for the creation of a viable Palestinian state on those lands. Jerusalem should be told that the United States will oppose, not tolerate, Israel's colonial expansion in the West Bank. None of this is to say that the United States should abandon Israel. On the contrary, the United States should defend Israel's right to exist within its pre-1967 borders with some minor modifications. And most importantly, if Israel's survival is threatened, the United States should come to its aid. Thank you.
Last thing I want to do is spill water all over myself to start. I want to thank MIT for inviting me to be here tonight. I think this is an important issue, an important debate for Americans to have. As I think I will make clear over the course of the next 15 minutes, there is much in this book that I do not agree with. I think in many ways it oversimplifies very, very complex situations. But I do think it is terribly important that we have a debate about this issue and every other issue related to America's position in the Middle East. Steve told us American policy had gone off the rails in the Middle East. I think that's putting it mildly. I think America's position in the Middle East has reached a catastrophic low point, and it may get even worse in the next 15 months. What I don't agree with is that Israel and its supporters in the United States, the Israel lobby, or lobbies, that is more accurately laid out in the book, is primarily responsible for this mess. I think we have met the enemy, and they are us. We, the American body politic, bipartisans, have to take a lot of the responsibility. And that is also granting John's point that I don't think Al Gore would have taken us to war either had his election been confirmed by the Supreme Court. What I was asked to do tonight was to talk about my experiences in government dealing with Israel and its friends in the United States, the Israeli lobby, or lobbies, as I think it is better to term them. Before I do that, though, I think I should begin with a bit more of a confession. By the standard of the book, I'm guilty. I'm a member of the Israeli lobby. I have worked with the Israeli intelligence services, the Mossad and the Shabak, for 30 years. I've worked with the Israeli Defense Forces. I've known the last 4 Israeli prime ministers by their first name. I have worked to get Israel the best possible intelligence, both in peacetime and in wartime. I have worked with 3 American presidents to try to advance the Arab-Israeli peace process. I was part of President Clinton's team at Wye River, at Shepherdstown, at Geneva, at Camp David, and at Sharm el-Sheikh. Along with Dennis Ross, I was one of the drafters of President Clinton's December 2000 parameters for a Middle East peace settlement, which I think remain the fundamental basis for a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I drafted President Bush's speech to the United Nations General Assembly in November 2001, in which he, for the first time for an American president, called for the creation of a Palestinian state. Perhaps worst of all, I work at the Saban Center, and I know Martin Indyk and Ken Pollack. In fact, I consider them my friends. But I am not a neocon, I am not a member of AIPAC, and I am not a supporter of this war. I think if we look at the record, particularly on Arab-Israeli peace process over the last 15 years, of which I have some intimate knowledge, we'll see that neither Israel nor its supporters in the United States were a juggernaut always getting what they wanted, nor did they get unconditional help, and in fact we had a much more complex relationship. Let me start with President Bush the Elder, or as I will call him, 41. President Bush in 1991, at the end of the liberation of Kuwait, saw a unique opportunity to create the basis for a comprehensive Arab-Israeli peace agreement. The destruction of the Soviet Union and the containment of Iraq provided an opportunity to move forward. He therefore summoned a peace conference in Madrid. The Israeli government was adamantly opposed to that conference. Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, as he made clear in his memoirs after the fact, thought the entire idea was a mistake, wanted nothing to do with a territorial agreement. This is a prime minister, after all, who voted against the Camp David agreement, even though his friend Menachem Begin had negotiated it. Bush 41 pressed ahead in the face of the obstacle of the government of Israel, the Prime Minister of Israel, and many of their supporters in the United States, including AIPAC. I recall vividly our fax machine at the National Security Council spitting out one message after another, arguing against using loan guarantees to pressure Israel to come to Madrid or to make concessions. 41 went forward. But he did more than that. 41 actively colluded with Yitzhak Rabin to have Likud voted out of office and to bring a labor government into power. Now, it is supposedly a rule of American politics that we never intervene in Israeli politics or that of any other democracy. Well, I'm here to tell you in 1992, 41 intervened forcefully, and the Israeli people got the message, and Yitzhak Rabin was elected. The result was a Rabin government that was prepared to make the opening to Oslo. President Clinton also did not provide unconditional and unwitting support. And he also stood up to parts of the lobby who opposed what he was doing. He inherited a Madrid process that was broken. When Yitzhak Rabin made the decision to go to Oslo to dramatically change the apple cart, many, if not most, of Israel's supporters in the United States suffered from severe whiplash. They couldn't believe that an Israeli government was prepared to negotiate with Yasser Arafat. And they adamantly opposed it in many quarters. President Clinton endorsed it, and over the course of the next 8 years would expend more political capital on trying to advance that process than any other single issue. Yasser Arafat would become, in his second term, the single most frequent foreign visitor to the Oval Office. When another Israeli government was elected by Bibi Netanyahu, which was elected against the Oslo Agreement, President Clinton pressured and worked with Bibi to get the Hebron Agreement and the Wye River Agreement. When he saw that Bibi would not support those, in fact, he made it abundantly clear once again to the Israeli people and to Israel's supporters in the United States that we wanted a change in government. And we got a change in government, Ehud Barak. Much of the pro-Israeli community in the United States, and particularly the neoconservative element of it, was adamantly and remains adamantly opposed to what Ehud Barak put on the table in Camp David, and even more importantly, to what President Clinton put on the table in the Clinton parameters. I don't think this book sufficiently captures the nuances and complexities of that situation. Some in the pro-Israeli community in the United States in the late 1990s were adamant supporters of what President Clinton was doing. Peace Now, Israel Policy Forum, and others enthusiastically pushed the president to go further, to meet with Arafat and Assad even more often than he wanted to himself. The neocons, Ginza, and other groups opposed it. It is not a simple picture of a lobby on one side or the other. There are complexities here. At the end of the day, Prime Minister Barak accepted President Clinton's proposals. Contrary to what you read in this book, Yasser Arafat rejected them. Don't take my word for it. Read My Life by Bill Clinton. Read what every Palestinian leader says today about wishing they could go back and change that decision. Imagine where the Palestinian people would be today had Yasser Arafat had a different outcome. Bush, 43. Let me be clear. I'm trying to already get it across. I'm not here to defend him. He inherited a crisis of a mounting intifada, and he came to the conclusion that President Clinton had wasted political capital on a problem which could not be resolved. He decided to give other priorities in the Middle East. I think those were fundamental mistakes, strategic miscalculations which have had catastrophic results. But President Bush didn't make those decisions on the basis of AIPAC. He made those on the basis of his own views and those of the men around him, Mr. Cheney, Mr. Rumsfeld, and his national security advisor at the time, Ms. Rice. They made the judgment to walk away from the Middle East peace process. Did Ariel Sharon welcome that? Of course he welcomed it. It was exactly what he wanted them to do. But I think it missed the cart before the horse to get it the other way. My bottom line is simple on this. Each of the three presidents I worked with, and President Clinton I worked with the most, chose his own policy, found supporters within the pro-Israeli community in the United States who supported those policies and enthusiastically endorsed them and went forward. That is not to say that the lobby is not influential. Clearly it is. But to call it a lobby and not recognize its diversity is to miss the point. Let me say a word about the war in Iraq. I fully agree, a catastrophic mistake, one of the biggest in American diplomatic history. But I think this week's Economist, in doing a review of the book, basically got it right. The evidence here is that the neocons took advantage of September 11th and a gullible president, and I don't think a gullible vice president, to do what they wanted done. Israel stood on the sidelines and in the beginning said, you got the wrong IRA country. You should be going after the other one. When it came to the conclusion that the president was not to be stopped, I think Ariel Sharon again said, fine, I'm not going to get in the way of this guy from Texas. If it works out, great. If it doesn't, it's his problem. My view is if you want to see who is responsible for the war in Iraq, you have to look in the mirror. Al-Qaeda and Israel. Here, I think they have a very legitimate point. Israel and Israeli policies are clearly driving recruitment for extremist groups, and not even extremist groups. It is self-evidently clear that Israel's policies in the West Bank and Gaza have alienated most of the Muslim world. But to say that Al-Qaeda, therefore, derives from that is to also miss a point. Al-Qaeda's opposition to American policy towards Israel is not over whether it should be 97% of the West Bank or 96% of the West Bank, or whether the right of the return should be respected in principle but not in theory, in practice, I'm sorry. It is over American support for the existence of an Israeli state. Al-Qaeda's position is very clear. No Israel. Ayman Zawahiri, bin Laden's deputy, got into the terrorism business in the early 1980s in order to help assassinate Anwar Sadat, not because Sadat had agreed to a Palestinian autonomy proposal, but because Sadat had made peace with Israel full circle. Osama bin Laden, as their book rightly points out, moved into the terrorism business because Saudi Arabia was supporting the Oslo process, which he saw as an anathema. In short, Al-Qaeda is in the business of conducting terrorism against the United States, not because of what our policies are towards 97% or settlement activity, or whether the Temple Mount should be Israeli control or not. Their opposition to is the fundamental U.S. support for the concept of an Israeli state. Lastly, there are many issues which are neglected in this analysis, and yet issues on which Israel and the lobby have exerted tremendous amount of activity. Let me just give you two. Pollard. serving in 3 White Houses, I never saw an issue that was raised more often by more Israeli prime ministers and by more supporters of Israel directly with the president than freedom for Mr. Pollard. That issue was brought up by every Israeli prime minister, Likud or Labor. And yet Mr. Pollard remains in jail. There was one brief moment when Bill Clinton considered letting him go, and that only to advance the Wye River Agreement. In the end, on this issue, Israel and its supporters in the United States have failed completely. China, Israel's multi-billion-dollar arms sales arrangements with China, which Secretary of Defense Bill Perry in the mid-1990s concluded were a fundamental threat to American national security interests. Every Israeli prime minister after that lobbied hard and asked the lobby and AIPAC to support him in trying to continue those sales. George Bush turned Ariel Sharon down on this in their first meeting flat-footed. The notion of a juggernaut that gets unconditional support just does not bear up in the historical record. My bottom line, yes, there are Israel lobbies in the United States. Yes, they're influential. But history shows they're not a juggernaut. They don't get unconditional aid. Most of all, blaming them for the mistakes this administration has made in the Middle East is to miss the point. It is to look at a tree and not see the forest. Responsibility for these mistakes belongs with the President of the United States, the Vice President, and the team of people that they brought in to advise them over the last 7 years. Thank you.
Thanks very much to each of the speakers. What I'd like to do is go directly to Q&A, but I really do think we ought to give Steve and John a chance to respond briefly to Bruce. If they wish to, you're going to yield your time?
We'll find a way to
All right.
explain where we disagree.
I'm grateful for that, and I think the audience will be too, to have the chance to talk with you directly. So we have mics in each of the aisles. And we need you to speak into the mics because we'll be preserving this on MIT World and give the larger world a chance to have access to your questions and to the answers. Now, to maximize the number of questions and the quality of the conversation, I'm going to take 2 or 3 at a time. I'll try to be fair going back and forth. I'll ask you to keep them as short as you possibly can without sacrificing sharpness, but I do reserve the right to shorten you if you're not sharp. Now, let me also say on the front end, we're not likely to be able to accommodate everyone who wants to join the conversation directly. But if you all are brief and you all are sharp, we're going to be likely to maximize the learning that we'll accomplish this evening. So why don't we start on this side? I ask you each to identify yourself and your affiliation, if you would, and identify the person to whom you're addressing the question.
My name's Sherry Alpert from Canton. I'm a member of AIPAC and CAMRA. I'm wondering why you haven't said anything in your book about the influence of the Saudi oil lobby in Washington and the fact that they've been extremely influential on both Bushes and that they've given Jimmy Carter $12 million prior to his writing his book. Also, your comment about Israel's so-called brutal treatment of Palestinians ignores the fact that the Palestinian Authority has been running the Palestinian territories for most of the last few years, and that they have treated them far worse and given them a far worse standard of living than they ever did under Israel.
Thank you. Let me take another one from the same side. We'll get to the other side next. Thank you.
Yes, Hani Mwafi, Boston University. Thank you all for your comments. My question has to do with the constituent elements of the U.S. foreign policy teams that help negotiate the Israeli-Palestinian peace solution. Mr. Riedel, thank you for your years of service to this country, and from your comments, you seem to have close ties with Israeli security forces as well. But rarely, if ever, are any Arab Americans present at the table when it's time to negotiate peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And I wanted to hear the comments.
Thank you. Let's get, there's no one, is there someone else on this aisle? You should take that. Yes, please. We'll take one more, and we'll ask our speakers to respond, and we'll go back to that.
My name is Ty. I'm an MIT student, undergraduate student. I'm an Israeli and a former IDF soldier. My question is, when we look at the lobby and the entire concept of it, I think the argument is whether the entire concept of whether the lobby is right or wrong. And I want to go into the disengagement from Gaza, which I personally participated in, and ask if the disengagement from Gaza, which removed all settlements from the Gaza Strip and looking back had no positive effect for Israel, how does that work with the lobby, and how does that work with the principle that the lobby is wrong just for being a lobby? If we look at that fact, wasn't the lobby a good thing, and shouldn't that be treated as something that more of whether the idea is right or wrong, instead of whether the lobby as a lobby is bad?
Thank you very much. Response?
Okay.
Steve, we'll just go right down.
I'm going to take a swing at the first one. First, it's not clear to me, and I'll talk mostly about the oil question. With all respect, I don't think the woman who asked the question has read the book, because there is, in fact, a detailed discussion of precisely that question in the book, where we talk about the much vaunted oil lobby and the much vaunted Saudi lobby, and explain why they, in fact, don't have much impact on American foreign policy. Energy companies in the United States lobby a lot. They're a very powerful political lobby, and they lobby about things like drilling policy and tax policy and environmental regulations and all sorts of things that you would expect corporations who are interested in making money to do. But they don't actually lobby very extensively on foreign policy. If you go to the website of the American Petroleum Institute, which is one of their big trade and lobbying organizations, you can't find any reference to foreign policy anywhere on the website. And there's an obvious reason for that, right? The oil companies want to make money. They don't want to invade countries like Iraq. They wanted to trade with Saddam if they had been allowed to. They would be trading with Iran today if they were allowed to. And in fact, when Dick Cheney was head of Halliburton, he complained publicly about what he called America's sanctions-happy foreign policy. Again, if oil companies were driving American Middle East policy, you'd expect it to be quite different what we actually see. And that's why AIPAC's former executive director, Morris Amate, once said, "We pretty much have the field to ourselves here in Washington," and why AIPAC's legislative director, former legislative director, Doug Bloomfield, said in 2003, "We have one great advantage. We really don't have any competition." Now, even if he overstated it a bit, that suggests that the oil lobby is just not driving policy. Finally, the reference to brutal Palestinian treatment. The PLO leadership under Yasser Arafat was deeply corrupt and didn't do nearly as much as they might have to better the lives of Palestinians. But they're not the ones building checkpoints. They're not the ones putting 250 miles of connector roads. They're not the ones who've doubled the settler population. And I think all one has to do is go to Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem, and you'll get a nice account of the brutal treatment being meted out to the Palestinian people. It doesn't come from me, it comes from Israelis, who are, I think, deeply admirable for pointing out that aspect of their society.
John?
I'll take the third question, which dealt with disengagement from Gaza, and Bruce is going to take the second question about the the American negotiating team. First of all, with regard to the disengagement from Gaza, I was actually quite shocked that many friends of mine in the United States and many Israelis were optimistic that this was going to be a first major step towards peace in the region. there's only one way the Israelis are going to ever have peace with the Palestinians, and that is to give them a viable state on almost all of the occupied territories. Until that happens, the Palestinians are going to use every means available to fight against the Israelis. And as the Israelis made clear, for those of you who read Haaretz and Ma'ariv and other Israeli newspapers, you know this, what Ariel Sharon was doing was pulling out of Gaza, right, and putting the peace process in what Dov Weissglass called formaldehyde. And what they were going to continue to do was to colonize the West Bank, which is what they've been doing since 1967, as Steve alluded to. If you look at what the Israelis did between 1993, when the Oslo peace process began, and the outbreak of the first Intifada in September of 2000, right, in that 7-year period, the Israelis confiscated 40,000 acres of Palestinian territory. They built 250 miles of connector roads. They doubled the settlers' population in the occupied territories, and they built 30 new settlements. This was during the Oslo peace process, when President Bill Clinton was the president, right? The Israelis have no intention of creating a viable Palestinian state. The Palestinians understand this, and therefore, they're going to fight back until they get a viable Palestinian state. Final point I would make about what happened with regard to Gaza, if you look carefully, basically the Palestinians are being treated like caged animals, right? The Israelis control all the borders around the Gaza, all the checkpoints in and out. They control the water beneath the area, and they control the air above the Gaza Strip. And the Palestinians have virtually no maneuver room whatsoever. And any time they strike back at the Israelis tighten the screws further and further. And the end result is more and more trouble. So this situation is, in my opinion, hopeless until the Israelis recognize that what they have to do is give the Palestinians a viable state. And the only way that's going to happen is if we put some pressure on the Israelis. And contrary to what Bruce says, we've never been very good at that.
Bruce?
Let me take the second question and then make a brief comment. I think it would be great if more Arab Americans were involved in our diplomacy in the Middle East. I urge Arab Americans to get involved in the Foreign Service, in the military, in the CIA, and be part of the process. In my own case, I laid out for you because I thought it was honest up front, my connections with Israel. I also have deep connections and friendships with many Jordanian, Egyptian, Saudi, Kuwaiti, Lebanese intelligence officers, military men, and diplomats, including many in the Saudi lobby, which we talked about before. I grew up in Jordan and Lebanon. I'm not an Arab American, but I think I have some sense of what's on their mind. In President Clinton's peace process team, one of the most influential figures was an Egyptian American who continues to work in the United States government, but who, if you read Bill Clinton's version of what happened at Camp David, was one of his critical advisors throughout. Yasser Arafat was asked in the Oslo process to provide security in return for a progressive return of land. He was unable to do so. We consistently urged him and tried to work with him to do better. The CIA provided enormous amount of support to the Palestinians to try to get them to live up to their end of the bargain. I agree with John. Israel didn't live up to its end of the bargain either. But to paint it as a simple picture of one side trying to do its utmost and the other not is to misread history. And above all, it misreads history to believe that at Camp David, and even more importantly, in December of 2000, one party said yes to an agreement based on a return to the 1967 borders with minor changes, which I think we heard both gentlemen earlier say is the fundamental basis of an agreement. The other side said no and walked away from the table. That was a catastrophic mistake for the Palestinians, which they regret, I think, certainly Abu Mazen does to this day.
You have a two-finger.
Yeah, just a two-finger. This has now been said twice. Bill Clinton's spokesman and then Bill Clinton himself, in a speech to the Israel Policy Forum, one of the moderate groups within the lobby, said that both sides had accepted the Clinton parameters of December 2000. Both sides also expressed reservations. Right? The Israeli reservations were contained in, I think, a 20-page letter that I believe has also never been made public. Right? The Palestinians also put out a long document explaining all of their reservations. But Bill Clinton said that in front of an audience. Right? You can go find it on the web where he says both sides accept this, both sides accept reservations. So the idea that one side bought it and the other side rejected it, I think, is simply not true. And there's also, remember, the negotiations continued at Taba afterwards, and it was the Israelis under Ariel Sharon that broke off that process.
Okay, we're going to go to the left side of the room, without regard for your political...
No, I'm not. Les
perspective?
Perlman Program in Writing and Humanistic Studies at MIT. I'm going to try to focus on a topic and try to get some agreement among the three speakers, dealing with one of the claims in the book and the article about tolerance and intolerance. And I think this event here is a great example of tolerance and of discourse and of speech. But can there be any denial that the, quote, Israeli lobby, this amalgamation, has actively tried to quelch discourse in the United States? And I just bring up right now the fact that Desmond Tutu has had his invitation revoked in Minneapolis at a university there after pressure from Jewish rabbis in the area. And again, you can go example after example. And from my own experience, living at times in England and seeing very different portrayals of the West Bank and what we see here in terms of, destruction of buildings and structures. That, again, I would just like to ask all three people, isn't it true, at least we can get agreement on the fact that our discourse in the United States is really, really limited in a way that is, I think, counterproductive? It's also, historically, intolerance has been very bad for Jews. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
My name is Yael Zussman. I'm an MIT alum. I've noticed that support for this thesis lines up with support for the underlying policy prescriptions that you would have the U.S. adopt, or the opponents of your position would have us adopt. Doesn't this book ultimately derive from the repeated failure of the political echelon to adopt your policy prescriptions? And there are a number of things that need to be addressed. For example, have you considered that maybe your policy is wrong? Have you considered that maybe you've been wrong about anything? Is it possible to disagree with you in good faith? And, I'd like to hear about some of these things, because if you're going to allege that there's this sort of a diabolical Israeli lobby, then there has to be some sort of presumption of bad faith.
Thank you. Next question. And the last one for this cluster.
Okay, hey, I'm Peter Krause. I'm a student here at MIT. I saw the book as kind of trying to start two debates, one being on the Israel lobby or lobbies and the extent to which they have influence within the United States, the other being something that all three of you agree with, which is whether the policies that are pushed for by the lobby are actually in the United States' interest and what we should do about this kind of failed U.S. policy within the Middle East. One of the unfortunate things is that I see the second debate as being far more important, but it seems that the debate that everybody focuses on is the first, is where is there an Israel lobby, does it have influence, whereas we don't spend too much time talking about what John concluded with, which was what we should actually do in terms of our policy in the Middle East and how it should be changed. So I guess I would ask, are you disappointed in the fact that the focus seems to be on the first debate, and how can we get to that second debate, which I feel like is much more important? Thank you.
You can take that too.
What order would you like to, John?
Well, I'll take the question on the Bishop Tutu question and squelching of debate. I think there's no doubt about it that the lobby goes to great lengths to squelch debate or to squelch criticism of Israeli policy, criticism of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, and open discussion about the power of the lobby itself. Jewish Voice for Peace has a website entitled Muzzle Watch, And on Jewish Voice for Peace's Muzzle Watch, they give all sorts of examples where people have tried to talk and have been stopped. Bishop Tutu is up there today. If you read the piece that's in Tikkun magazine, the most recent issue of Tikkun magazine by Rabbi Lerner on the Israel lobby, he lists a whole series of examples where he has been prevented from talking. Steve and I were both invited to go to Israel by Yuri Avnery, and he told us in the letter of invitation of instances where he has come to the United States and had all sorts of speaking engagements canceled because his hosts came to realize that he was going to say things that they didn't want said in the United States. We could tell you all sorts of examples involving ourselves. Every place we go, there's pressure brought to bear to cancel our talks.
Not every place.
Not every place? Okay, I take that back. MIT being the exception in that regard. That's nice to hear, but you all know what happened to us at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. City University of New York canceled our appearance, and then 2 professors there tried to get it rescheduled and were unable to do it. We were supposed to speak at Google last month, and that talk was canceled. And the person who's in charge of handling these Google book events says it's the only case that he knows of in the history of Google where a book event was canceled. We're trying to get that rescheduled, but they're dragging their feet, and I'd bet a lot of money it doesn't happen. I could go on and on telling you examples, and we're not the only people who've come under this kind of pressure. And it's a fundamentally different situation that exists in countries like Israel and countries in Europe, especially Britain. As Steve pointed out in his comments, if you look at the media in Britain, and you look at the media, especially in Israel, look at Haaretz. It's just a much richer debate about all of these subjects than you find in the United States. I mean, the idea of an Arab American actually having a major column in the New York Times or the Washington Post is laughable, or an Arab American or anybody who's pro-Arab being on the Israeli peace team is laughable, right? As Aaron Miller, who you know well, who was on the peace team with you, said that Dennis Ross himself, Martin Indyk, and others, who are all deeply committed to Israel, basically acted as Israel's lawyers. That's his language. They acted as Israel's lawyers during the Camp David negotiations. This is the world that we live in. And when people like us point out what is really obvious to anybody with a triple-digit IQ, right? We're accused of being raving anti-Semites or having written the second coming of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, right? Anyway, I will stop there.
Les's question was to try to find consensus, so we can give Bruce a chance to...
Obviously, I wouldn't be here if I didn't think that we should have this debate. I support the notion of putting it on the table. As I said at the beginning, we're in a mess. We need to figure out how we got there and come up with a better way out. What I don't find very appealing is single, simple solutions to explain the past or the future. You can find all kinds of quotations, but I have to, in all due respect, say one thing. I was there. I know what happened in December 2000. Ehud Barak said, yes, this is a basis for a deal, and I accept it. Yasser Arafat said no. He said it in a long-winded way. Don't look at what a White House press spokesman said on a day in order to provide spin. All White House press spokesmen's daily briefings are spin. Look at what the president himself wrote in his memoirs, what everyone who participated in those conversations said. Arafat said no, Clinton said yes. Now, I'm sorry, Barak said yes.
Please, please.
Yeah.
I think if you're looking for an area of agreement here today, that in fact on the fundamentals of what is important to do next, the three of us agree. Moving forward on the Arab-Israeli process, on the basis of the Clinton parameters or something very close to that. That's what their book says. That's what I've heard them say here today, and that's where I stand as well.
There were two other questions. One, I think, was sort of implying that we wrote the book because the world has not listened to our policy prescriptions over the years, and we got angry and decided to write a book. No. I mean, the fact of the matter is, if you think about interest groups cause lots of dumb policies. I think most people, if they look at America's agriculture policy, would say that the farm bill that gets passed every year is silly. It's not in the American national interest. And farmers, by the way, are about 2% of the American population. But somehow we pass this farm bill that subsidizes the growing of corn and all sorts of other things. And we all know it's kind of stupid, but it happens because politically the farm lobby is pretty influential. Most people in this room, I suspect, would think that America's gun control policy, or I should say lack of a gun control policy, is not in the American national interest, and it's not because 65% of the American population is a member of the NRA. All right, the NRA doesn't even represent, in my view, the views of the median gun owner, let alone the median American, but it's produced a policy outcome that's wrong. And our argument in the book is that the influence of the Israel lobby, broadly defined, and in particular the most influential parts of it, has also led to policies that are not good for the country. And that leads me to the...
Or for Israel.
Or for Israel, all right. And that leads me to the last part. The whole second half of the book is essentially answering that second question, where we do look at our policy towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, our policy towards Syria, our policy in the Lebanon war, Iraq has already been mentioned, and Iran. And in each of those cases, our argument, you don't have to accept it, but our argument is the policy has, first of all, not been good for the United States, but also in each one of these cases not been good for Israel as well. All right? And that the United States would be a better friend to Israel if we were more critical of what they were doing. We would have been a better friend to Israel if we had never let the settlements project get underway, a point that many Israelis now wish had happened, if they'd never begun, never gone down that road, very costly, prolonged the conflict with the Palestinians, undermined their international image substantially, strategic and moral disaster, which is what Leon Wieseltier called it. Right? We would have been a better friend if we had stopped that in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s or the 90s, but of course the United States never put any serious leverage on Israel to stop building settlements. You could make the same argument, I would argue, about the Lebanon war of summer 2006, where we did Israel no favors by prolonging the war, allowing the war to continue, instead of either getting them to adopt a different strategy going into it or getting a ceasefire very quickly. And again, we argue in the book that that was largely due to the interventions of various groups in the lobby. So the point is, we deal at great length with the question of, is it good for us and good for Israel? And it's all in part 2 of the book.
Thanks. We're going to swing back to this side of the room, please. Again, identify yourself. Short, sharp questions. Thank you.
My name's James Williamson, formerly of the Lowell Institute. A question for anybody, but I find that what Steve and John have laid out to be rather moderate and actually rather cautious in a way. And while I share your view, I support the idea of a pragmatic solution that would involve a two-state solution. I'd like to ask you to be a little more daring and address 2 aspects that Steve in particular mentioned in his presentation. The first is, in what sense is Israel really a democratic state? And secondly, in what sense is there a right of an exclusively Jewish state to exist in Palestine? Because it seems to me that that really is a central core issue and a central core problem from which has been the source of a lot of the rest of the difficulties that we're now struggling to find a compromise solution for.
Thank you. Next.
Hi, my name is Freddie Dworkin. I'm a member of the community and of the Jewish community as well as the American community. I'm reminded of being at a demonstration sponsored by the CJP, the mainstream organization of the Jewish community here in Boston. And an Israeli finally said to me in frustration, "You Americans, you have no right to tell us what to do. We're Israelis." And I looked at her and with an amazed look. I said, "Honey, you take our bucks, you get our opinions." My question is, when we're talking about the lobby, what we're talking about is what happens to the discourse in this country and who has powerful voices. And I have a question for you, sir. I'm sorry I forget your name, the man who worked with Clinton. I was disturbed by some of the things
Bruce
that...
Riedel.
Bruce, I'm sorry. I was disturbed by a couple of your approaches that I see happening over and over again in the States. One problem that I had, and I'm sure that the...
Short, sharp questions.
Okay. Why did you set up straw men of what Walt and Bruce were saying, and then you were misquoting them, and then you shot down what they said, and I found that disturbing. My other question is that in this country, that we don't look at an accurate picture of what Israel is doing in regards to the Palestinians, to offer a settlement, when you talk about Barak's settlement, that includes large areas of the Palestinian country-to-be, of the West Bank, that are settlements where there are connector roads back and forth, where there is 40% of the land taken away.
I'm sorry, but you really have to make this a question, and then we have another questioner behind you. Thank you.
That's not giving Palestinians a viable country, and I wonder why in this country we can't say that in newspaper articles, why you can't say that straightforwardly, why that's not being presented.
Thank you very much. One more. One more from this cluster.
Okay, and I'll take the first one.
Hello, my name is Nicholas Kenny. I'm a student at the Fletcher School. And first of all, I just want to thank you for having the courage to set off this debate. I think it's extremely important. And you represent for me part of the best parts of academia in making us look hard at some tough issues. I don't know if I agree with everything you said. And one thing I might take issue with a little bit is this idea of it the lobby representing Israeli opinion in general. I just spent about a year there, and as you were alluding to earlier, the debate there is much richer. The points of view are much wider, and my question is, and this might be a more interesting research question if you want to write another book, why the default is this kind of Likud lobby. I would call it a Likud lobby, not an Israel lobby, and why the default is to the kind of right-wing views that we see. Thank you.
John?
Yeah, I'll take the first question on Israel as a democracy and Israel as a Jewish state. First of all, on Israel as a democracy, I think there is no question that it is a democracy. I think it's a flawed democracy, and that would be true of most democracies. And the principal way in which it's a flawed democracy is, by almost all accounts of the Israelis themselves, the Palestinians, and I'm talking here about the Palestinians who are citizens in Israel, are treated as second-class citizens. All you have to do is go back and read the Orr Commission report from a few years back to see that that is clearly the case. But nevertheless, I do think that otherwise it is a vibrant democracy, and the claim that it's the only democracy in the Middle East is true. The much trickier issue is the question of Israel as a Jewish state. And let me make a number of points about that. There's no question that it is a Jewish state. In that sense, it's fundamentally different from the United States. Despite the fact that John McCain has recently been saying that the United States is a Christian state, we are not a Christian state, and that's a good thing. We are a liberal state, and we believe, and I think it's a wonderful thing, in the separation of church and state. It's a secular state. It's a stereotypical liberal state, the United States. Israel does not fit that bill. It's a Jewish state. I feel a lot of sympathy for that because of the history of anti-Semitism, especially the Holocaust. I think it's a good thing that there's a Jewish state, given what's happened to Jews over time, mainly at the hands of the Christian world, not the Arab and Islamic world. But be that as it may, I'm glad there's a Jewish state. But it is a different kind of entity than the United States. But it, I think, is the case that the United States is more of the exception than Israel is. I think if you look around the world, right, there is this German state, right, this country called Germany. And I remember when I was a little boy, my mother told me, my mother, who is pure German in terms of background, told me that she could go back to Germany and be accepted as a German citizen because, you know, her grandparents from God knows when came across the Atlantic Ocean from Germany at some particular point in time. So there was this sense of Germanness. And you all know about the problems that Turks have in Germany becoming German citizens and so forth and so on. But most states around the world are like that, and they deserve our respect, even though they're different than the United States. So I think that the fact that Israel is a Jewish state is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not the kind of country I'd like to live in. I like living in a liberal state like the United States, where church and state are clearly separated. But they've chosen to go a different way, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, with two major caveats. One is I think that they should go to great lengths not to treat the Palestinian citizens of Israel as second-class citizens. And number two, as we've stressed repeatedly here, and I think Bruce and Steve and I are all in agreement, and I would assume most of the people in the audience are in agreement on this, it's imperative that they treat the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in a fundamentally different way than they've been treating them up to now.
Thanks. Bruce, did you want to respond?
I just respond as the man who worked for Clinton. The proposals the president put on the table in December 2000 would have led to the return of 100% of Gaza, 97% of the West Bank, with swaps of land of between 1% and 3%. It was clear, and it's in the proposals, that the settlements in those areas to be turned over to the Palestinians would have to go. If the settlers individually chose to stay in a Palestinian Authority, that would be their decision and the Palestinian Authority's decision as to what would happen to them. But it was inherent in those proposals that the settlements, road activity in the area turned over to an independent Palestinian state would end. Now, instead of debating history here, which we've done back and forth, let me point to a different line. One of the most important things about what's been going on in Israel in the last couple of years is that an overwhelming majority of Israelis have now come around to the conclusion that something like the Clinton proposal is the right way to go forward. Ehud Olmert was elected prime minister 2 years ago, largely on the commitment to withdraw from the West Bank. Now, his mishandling of the situation in Lebanon destroyed his capacity to do that. But when I look forward to 2009, when I look forward to 2009, I take some measure of optimism from the fact that I think there is now a broad consensus among many Israelis that that should be the basis upon which an agreement goes forward. Last point. I think that the gentleman who talked about a Likud lobby put his finger very much on the right place. If you want to talk about who has had influence in opposing moving process forward, it is the Likud party, Likud politicians, and their sympathizers in the United States. That, I think, is a more realistic understanding of the essence of the problem. I believe the United States should actively be supporting those political parties in Israel, as 41 did with Yitzhak Rabin and Clinton did with Ehud Barak, who want to move the process forward. What I think is the great deficiency of Bush 43 is that he stood back and let Likud politicians call the tune.
Steve?
Yeah,
Three quick points, I hope. This was in response to the last question. Certainly, many of the most important and influential groups in the lobby do not represent the views of many Israelis, do not represent the views of many Jewish Americans. I tried to make that clear. And I agree with Bruce's point about we have had a situation where the most important groups in the lobby, like AIPAC, have tended to be lined up with the more hardline elements. But I don't think one should see, the usual stereotype that there are these bad guys in the Likud and there are these good guys in the Labor Party, for example. And if just the Labor Party were back in power, they would immediately go to a two-state solution, get out of all the occupied territories. That's, again, I think, a misreading of what Labor's position has been in the past. Second, there are a number of cases, and Bruce alluded to them, where there were rifts between the American government and Israeli politicians and groups in the lobby. Rabin didn't like AIPAC very much, for example. But it's worth noting that if you go and read Shlomo Ben-Ami's book, Scars of War, Wounds of Peace, he's the former Israeli foreign minister, he points out that the two American presidents who did the most for Middle East peace were Jimmy Carter and George W. Bush. And he explains why. He says those were the two presidents who were most willing to stand up to the Israeli lobby. All right, that's Shlomo Ben-Ami talking, not just me. Finally, I want to underscore a point that Bruce made, but it was a point that I actually was trying to make too, and that is that this is a loose coalition and there's a lot of heterogeneity within it. Right? Americans for Peace now is not the same as, say, the Zionist Organization of America, or God forbid, and I mean that literally, Christians United for Israel. But the point is, the most well-funded, influential, politically connected groups, right, tend to be on the hardline end of the spectrum. So, again, if you read the conclusions of the book, we say, look, apart from campaign finance reform, which we will go to our graves all waiting for, and would deal with all special interest groups, the only thing in the near term to hope for is either a change in the balance of power within this coalition, so that groups like Israel Policy Forum are suddenly more influential, which I think is an uphill fight, or one could hope for a change in the views of the major organizations. All right, there's nothing wrong with having a politically influential pro-Israel community in the United States if it was pushing for policies that were good for the United States and good for Israel. Our view is, of course, that the most important organizations have been pushing policies that are unintentionally harmful to both countries. Right? But I don't have a problem with there being a powerful pro-Israel community. I just wish it was pushing a set of policies that were smarter.
Thanks very much, Steve. Well, as we anticipated, and as I'm sure you all understand, we've reached the end of our allotted time, and so I have to apologize for those of you still in the queue who would like to have had a chance to ask questions that we can't accommodate you, and I am very sorry about that. But I would like to thank Annie Abondante, Michelle Nuge, Casey Johnson-Houlihan for their staff work on making this event possible, and especially I want to thank our speakers, each of them, for really what was a remarkable conversation. Thank you.
Oh, good. Now they're going to feed us, right?
I hope so.